The blueprint. Understanding the ceremonies. They strapped Vivien Leigh, Scarlett O'Hara herself, to a table and passed electrical currents through her brain until she couldn't remember filming her greatest performances, and her husband did it with a single signature. 9 other Hollywood legends faced the same nightmare, some locked away for years, some silenced forever, because studios, husbands, and families weaponized psychiatric institutions against any woman who became difficult, inconvenient, or knew too much. Clara Bow, the it girl, destroyed by her own father. The woman who embodied the jazz age itself, bobbed hair bouncing, lips painted dark, energy that made silent films electric with life, became one of institutionalization's most tragic victims, not at the hands of a studio or husband, but through betrayal by her own father. Clara Bow exploded onto movie screens in the 1920s, defining an entire era with her modern sensibility and raw magnetism. Born in Brooklyn in 1905, Clara survived a childhood marked by devastating poverty and her mother's severe mental illness. Her mother, Sarah, had attempted to harm her during a psychotic episode, and her father, Robert, was largely absent, neglectful, and opportunistic. Yet from this traumatic beginning, Clara rose to become Hollywood's biggest box office star by 1928, earning over $7,000 per week. But Clara's meteoric success came with a price her father viewed as an opportunity. Robert Bow, and later her secretary Daisy DeVoe, exploited her financially, treating her earnings as their personal fortune. By 1931, the pressures had mounted beyond what Clara could bear. Her secretary's embezzlement trial exposed intimate details of Clara's private life to a scandal-hungry public, and Clara suffered a nervous breakdown. But why did Clara, one of Hollywood's smartest business minds, trust these people with her finances? Because Robert had convinced her that her mother's mental illness was hereditary, that Clara herself might go crazy like Sarah did. He'd planted seeds of doubt for years, making her believe she needed his protection. The true betrayal came in 1949. After years in retirement, Clara's own father had her committed to the Institute of Living in Connecticut, citing schizophrenia. But Clara showed none of the classic symptoms. So why did doctors agree? Biographer David Sten's research uncovered the answer. Robert Bow paid them. Medical records unsealed in the 1980s showed cash payments to the committing physician. While Clara was confined, Robert managed her finances, accessing the fortune she had worked so desperately hard to build. The paperwork from the Institute of Living tells the brutal truth. She endured forced sedation, isolation in locked wards, and institutional routines designed to break a patient's will. The night before her father signed the commitment papers, Clara had been teaching neighborhood children to dance in her yard. The next morning, she was dragged to a psychiatric hospital while Robert accessed her bank accounts. In later interviews, Clara described the commitment as worse than being in prison. At least in prison, she explained, you knew what you had done to deserve being there. Clara was released after several months, but she never worked again. The commitment had been publicized. In 1950, a stay in a psychiatric institution was career-ending. Her father had destroyed her twice, once by stealing her freedom, twice by ensuring she could never rebuild. The vivacious woman who had defined the flapper era retreated entirely from public life. She remained a recluse until her passing in 1965, the spark that had made her a star extinguished by the institution that was supposed to help her. But if a father could weaponize psychiatric commitment for profit, what would a husband do to silence a wife who knew his darkest secrets? Vivien Leigh, when genius became madness. The woman who would become one of theater and cinema's greatest actresses found that her artistic brilliance was repeatedly diagnosed as an illness requiring the most brutal treatments medicine could offer. Vivien Leigh captured 2 Oscars, one for her iconic portrayal of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and another for her searing performance as Blanche Dubois in A Streetcar Named Desire. Married to the legendary Laurence Olivier, Vivien represented theatrical royalty. Behind this glamorous facade lived a woman struggling with what we now recognize as bipolar disorder, a condition that manifested through extreme mood swings, periods of intense creative energy alternating with devastating depression, and hypersensitivity during manic phases that scandalized the conservative 1950s establishment. Vivien's first major breakdown occurred in 1953 during the filming of Elephant Walk in Ceylon. She had to be removed from the production and flown back to England for treatment. This marked the beginning of a 14-year cycle of hospitalizations. Commitment laws in Britain allowed husbands to institutionalize wives with shocking ease. A signature, a cooperative doctor, and a woman's freedom could vanish overnight. Biographer Hugo Vickers authorized biography documents that between 1953 and 1967, Vivien was committed to psychiatric hospitals at least 5 times. The primary treatment centered on electroconvulsive therapy. Doctors strapped her to a table and passed electrical currents through her brain to induce violent seizures. Garson Kanin recalled in his memoir that Vivien told him the treatments had destroyed significant portions of her memory. She could no longer remember filming some of her greatest performances. Between electroshock sessions, Vivien would recite Shakespeare from memory. Even as her own memories disappeared, she could still remember Blanche Dubois' lines perfectly. The character's descent into madness stayed intact, while Vivien's own reality crumbled. After the first dozen treatments, she stopped recognizing some of her oldest friends. After 2 dozen, she struggled to remember where she'd grown up. After 3 dozen, fragments of her marriage to Olivier had simply vanished. Olivier, torn between his deep love for Vivien and his own exhaustion, eventually left her in 1960. His diaries reveal a man racked with guilt, watching her forget their happiest moments together. Studios and the press cooperated in keeping the full truth hidden, reporting only exhaustion or recurring tuberculosis. ECT in the 1950s was administered with voltages far higher than modern protocols, often without anesthesia. The seizures were so violent, they sometimes fractured bones. Yet she continued working despite her deteriorating condition. Her role in Ship of Fools in 1965 showcased an actress still capable of remarkable depth, even as treatment stole her past. September 1967, London. Vivien Leigh's housekeeper found her in her bedroom, the tuberculosis that had haunted her for decades finally claiming victory. She was 53. The tragedy wasn't her illness. Bipolar disorder deserves treatment and compassion. The tragedy was the crude treatments that erased parts of her brilliance rather than preserving it. She would sometimes ask friends to tell her about filming Gone with the Wind, hungry to hear stories of experiences she could no longer remember living. If Vivien Leigh's illness was at least acknowledged as medical, another star's commitment revealed something even more insidious: how grief in a woman was treated as madness, requiring institutional correction. Jean Tierney, the mother, silenced by grief. The exquisite Jean Tierney, whose luminous beauty graced the screen in Laura and Leave Her to Heaven, carried a secret sorrow that would lead her family to use psychiatric institutions as a tool of control. In 1943, while pregnant, Jean contracted German measles after a fan broke quarantine at the Hollywood canteen, specifically to meet her. That thoughtless act had catastrophic consequences. Jean's daughter Daria was born severely disabled, profoundly intellectually impaired, partially blind, requiring lifetime institutional care. The guilt Jean experienced was overwhelming. She blamed herself for attending the Hollywood canteen that day. This devastating maternal guilt triggered severe depression that would shadow the rest of her life. Jean wrote in her 1979 autobiography, Self-Portrait, "I was grieving, not insane, but grief in a woman was treated as madness." Between 1953 and 1957, Jean's husband Oleg Cassini and her mother had her hospitalized multiple times at Harkness Pavilion and the Institute of Living in Hartford, Connecticut. Medical records confirm she underwent 27 electroshock treatments. 27 times, electrical currents tore through her brain. The therapy was brutal and degrading. Jean later revealed the commitment happened partly because her depression was inconvenient to her family. She questioned their decisions about Daria's care, challenging where her daughter should be placed. She withdrew from Hollywood's social obligations, unable to maintain the glamorous facade expected of a star. She asked difficult questions about why Daria had to be institutionalized so young, whether she could bring her daughter home. These questions made her family uncomfortable. Her grief threatened their appearance of normalcy, so they used psychiatric commitment to remove Jean from their lives until she learned to be quiet and compliant. Jean wrote something that still haunts. "Every time they strapped me down for another treatment, I'd whisper Daria's name, trying to hold on to at least that. After 27 sessions, sometimes I couldn't remember if I'd said it out loud or only in my head." The electroshock treatments destroyed memories. Jean lost years of her life, lost memories of her daughter during the few years when Daria was young, lost time she could never reclaim. The treatments didn't cure her grief because grief isn't an illness. It's a natural human response to devastating loss. But the treatments taught her to hide her feelings, to stop questioning, to become the compliant woman her family wanted. Jean eventually recovered enough to resume her career briefly, appearing in The Left Hand of God in 1955. She divorced Cassini in 1952, and in 1960 married Texas oilman Howard Lee, finally finding some peace. But the years lost to institutions and memories erased by electroshock haunted her. She wrote, "They took my memories, but they couldn't take my guilt." But at least Jean's family hid behind the pretense of helping her heal. The next star would face something far more calculated: institutionalization as a weapon wielded to break any woman who dared challenge Hollywood's rules. Mercedes McCambridge. The cycle she couldn't escape. The woman who would become one of the most controversial figures in Hollywood institutionalization history defied every expectation placed upon her, and the system made certain she paid the ultimate price. Mercedes McCambridge won the Academy Award for All the King's Men in 1949, her distinctive voice later immortalized as the demon in The Exorcist. Behind her professional achievements lived a woman battling severe alcoholism and cycling through psychiatric commitments that revealed the brutal inadequacy of addiction treatment. Unlike many stars who hid their struggles, Mercedes displayed remarkable candor. Her 1981 autobiography, The Quality of Mercy, documents that she was institutionalized at least 8 times between 1950 and 1969 for alcohol addiction treatment. These weren't brief stays. They were extended commitments to facilities employing the harshest methods available. Treatments included forced sedation, hydrotherapy involving submersion in ice baths, prolonged isolation, aversion therapy that made patients violently ill, and experimental electroshock. Mercedes described genuinely brutal conditions: patients physically restrained for days, their wrists raw from struggling against leather straps, staff who viewed addicts with contempt, guards who mocked patients during withdrawal. Each release came with intensified stigma. Studios grew reluctant to hire her. The cycle became inescapable. She would drink to cope with shame and professional rejection. Drinking would lead to another commitment, and commitment would result in more stigma. After the third institutionalization, Mercedes tried to fight back. She hired lawyers, demanded better treatment, and spoke to reporters about brutal realities. Each attempt backfired. Studios blacklisted her further. Facilities labeled her difficult and extended her stays. The paperwork tells the brutal truth: 8 separate institutionalizations over nearly 2 decades. The methods were not only ineffective, but often counterproductive, creating additional trauma. The ice baths didn't cure alcoholism. They created terror. The isolation didn't promote reflection. It deepened despair. Mercedes finally achieved sobriety in 1969 through Alcoholics Anonymous, a program offering community, understanding, and a path forward without punishment. She remained sober until her passing in 2004, becoming a passionate advocate for addiction treatment reform. But the tragic epilogue reveals the intergenerational impact. Her son John, who had spent his childhood watching his mother disappear into psychiatric facilities again and again, never fully recovered. He remembered waiting by windows, wondering if she'd come home. In 1987, John ended the lives of his wife and 2 daughters before ending his own life. Mercedes spent her remaining years haunted by whether her struggles had damaged her son irreparably. She wrote, "I survived the institutions, but I'm not sure my family did." Mercedes stands as one of the first major stars to speak openly about psychiatric institutionalization, breaking decades of enforced silence. Even as she carried the unbearable weight of wondering what her survival cost those she loved most, she never stopped advocating for treatment reform. If you're as shocked as I am by how these beloved stars were treated, please subscribe to Golden Age Files. We're committed to uncovering the truth behind Hollywood's most carefully guarded secrets. Because what happened to our next star reveals that institutionalization wasn't just about controlling difficult women. It was about making an example that would terrify every actress in Hollywood. Frances Farmer, the rebel they broke. The intelligent, outspoken Frances Farmer challenged Hollywood's phoniness and paid a price so devastating that her story became a cautionary tale whispered among actresses for generations. Unlike compliant starlets who smiled for cameras and followed studio orders, Frances brought Seattle-bred independence and genuine intellectual curiosity to an industry that valued neither. She criticized Hollywood's artificiality, calling out fake publicity stunts. She refused to pose for cheesecake photos. She supported leftist political causes, attending labor rallies, and speaking out against fascism. She challenged studio executives who treated her like property. Paramount Studios labeled Frances difficult, ungrateful, and uncontrollable. By 1942, they'd dropped her contract and her career was in freefall. But the industry's revenge had only begun. What followed would serve as a warning. This is what happens when you refuse to play our game. In January 1943, Frances was arrested for driving under the influence and violated probation. Her mother, Lillian, who had spent years attempting to control her independent daughter, saw an opportunity. Lillian signed commitment papers, and Frances was sent to Western State Hospital in Washington State. She would remain institutionalized for 7 years, from 1944 to 1950. Hospital records and investigative journalist William Arnold's research document the conditions at Western State Hospital were horrific. The facility was severely overcrowded. Patient abuse by staff was documented and widespread. Female patients experienced assault from orderlies and guards who faced no consequences. The institutional environment was designed for containment and punishment, not healing. Frances underwent brutal insulin shock therapy, documented in her medical records. Doctors injected her with massive doses of insulin to induce hypoglycemic coma and seizures. The theory was that shocking the brain would cure mental illness. In reality, the treatment caused neurological damage, memory loss, and psychological trauma while providing no therapeutic benefit. There has been controversy surrounding whether Frances underwent a transorbital lobotomy. While some accounts claim this, credible historians like Erica Good have found no conclusive evidence. Journalist William Arnold later admitted fabricating certain details. What records do confirm is insulin shock therapy, brutal institutional conditions including documented physical abuse, and 7 years of confinement that left Frances psychologically devastated. Frances later wrote in her posthumously published 1972 autobiography, "Will there really be a morning? I wasn't insane when they took me, but 7 years in that place? 7 years of being treated like I was already lost. That might have been enough to make anyone lose themselves." She described 7 years in hell, the dehumanization of being stripped and cataloged like livestock, the powerlessness of screaming that you didn't belong there while doctors made notes, the knowledge that she'd been placed there for refusing to comply with her mother's control and Hollywood's expectations. Frances was released in 1950, her spirit broken. She attempted a brief television career, but Hollywood had effectively blacklisted her. The woman, once hailed as one of the most promising talents, ended her days working as a hotel clerk in Indianapolis. She passed away in 1970, just as her autobiography was being prepared for publication. Journalist Erica Good later wrote, "Whether or not the lobotomy happened, the studio system succeeded in its goal, destroying the woman who dared to defy it." Frances Farmer's institutionalization served as a warning to every actress in Hollywood. Defy the system, refuse to play by the rules, insist on being treated as an intelligent human being, and this is what awaits you. 7 years stolen, career destroyed. Life is reduced to poverty and obscurity. The message was clear and chilling, but what if the reason for your institutionalization wasn't defiance at all? What if doctors simply couldn't recognize the real illness destroying you? Rita Hayworth, when Alzheimer's was called alcoholism. In 1980, when Rita Hayworth was finally diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at age 62, her daughter, Princess Yasmin, asked doctors a devastating question. How long has she had this? The answer shattered everything. 25 years. For a quarter century, Rita Hayworth, the woman who had embodied glamour as Gilda, had been blamed, shamed, and institutionalized for an illness no one had bothered to identify correctly. The late 1950s. Rita was still only in her 40s, still beautiful. But those closest to her noticed troubling changes. She developed severe memory lapses, forgetting conversations that had occurred hours earlier, asking the same questions repeatedly. Emotional outbursts became frequent. She would burst into tears for no apparent reason or lash out in anger at imagined slights. She would stumble and appear disoriented, struggling to maintain balance. On film sets, she couldn't remember her lines. She would read the same script page 5 times and still draw a blank when cameras rolled. Studio executives and industry insiders whispered that Rita was drunk, that she couldn't handle aging and fading fame. The assumption was clear and cruel. Fading female stars couldn't handle obscurity and turned to alcohol. She was damaged goods, washed up, pathetic. No one seriously considered that Rita might be suffering from a degenerative brain disease. Princess Yasmin's interviews document that throughout the 1960s, Rita was hospitalized multiple times for what doctors diagnosed as chronic alcoholism and severe depression. The treatments she received were designed for these misdiagnoses. Family and friends staged interventions, reducing her to tears as she insisted she wasn't drunk. Doctors prescribed sedatives that actually worsened her confusion. At one facility, they administered electroshock therapy, passing electrical currents through a brain already deteriorating from Alzheimer's, adding insult to injury. None of the treatments helped because they were treating the wrong disease. Rita's condition worsened year by year. For a woman in her 40s exhibiting memory problems, the default diagnosis was alcoholism or female hysteria, not neurological disease. Alzheimer's research in the 1950s and 60s was primitive, rarely diagnosed in patients under 65. Medical experts reviewing Rita's case concluded she had likely been showing Alzheimer's symptoms as early as 1956 or 57, making her one of the youngest documented cases of early-onset Alzheimer's. Rita's biographer, Barbara Leeming, documented symptoms appearing in the mid-1950s. The tragedy is staggering. An entire quarter-century was defined by misdiagnosis and inappropriate treatment. All those years of being called a drunk, all those years of being institutionalized for alcoholism, all those years of receiving electroshock therapy for what was actually dementia. The electroshock therapy given for Alzheimer's represents medical malpractice of the highest order, yet no one was held accountable. September 1987. Princess Yasmin sat by her mother's bedside as Rita's life drew to a close. In a 1985 interview with People magazine, Yasmin revealed, "My mother spent 2 decades being blamed for an illness no one understood." Yasmin transformed her mother's tragedy into purpose, becoming a prominent Alzheimer's advocate and helping establish the Alzheimer's Association. Rita Hayworth's name became synonymous with Alzheimer's awareness, her misdiagnosis helping prevent future patients from enduring the same decades of shame. From medical tragedy, we move to calculated threat, because for another star, her beauty made her dangerous, and the studio had a plan to silence anyone who might reveal their darkest secrets. Lana Turner, the studio's solution to scandal. Within 24 hours of Johnny Stompanato's passing in April 1958, MGM studio heads had already convened an emergency meeting. The question wasn't whether Lana Turner was guilty. The jury would handle that. The question was, how do we silence her before she says something we can't control? Their answer would reveal Hollywood's most sinister weapon. The glamorous star known as MGM's Sweater Girl, platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed, curves that drew wolf whistles, discovered that surviving scandal meant facing the studio's ultimate weapon. Lana Turner represented Hollywood glamour in its most polished form during the 1940s and 50s. Behind the carefully maintained image lived a woman whose tumultuous personal life and knowledge of studio secrets made her vulnerable to one of Hollywood's darkest control mechanisms. The year 1958 brought one of Hollywood's most sensational events to Lana's doorstep. Her teenage daughter Cheryl fatally wounded Lana's boyfriend, gangster Johnny Stompanato, claiming she was protecting her mother from his violence. Cheryl drove a kitchen knife into Stompanato's abdomen as he threatened to disfigure Lana's famous face. The trial exposed every detail of Lana's turbulent relationship, his jealous rages, his physical abuse, his mob connections, revealing a side of her life studios had worked tirelessly to conceal. The jury returned a verdict of justifiable action, but the scandal had ripped away the glamorous facade. Investigative accounts and biographer Cheryl Crane's memoir, Detour, a Hollywood story document, that the period immediately following revealed how far studios would go to control their stars. Studio chief Benny Thau reportedly told executives a sanitarium stay would show she's traumatized, not complicit, and keep her from saying too much to the press. The logic was coldly calculated. If Lana were committed, it would support the narrative that she was a victim requiring professional care. More importantly, commitment would ensure she couldn't give unscripted interviews or make statements contradicting the studio's carefully managed version. She would be effectively silenced while appearing to receive compassionate treatment. While Lana avoided actual commitment, she wasn't free to act independently. Studio executives placed her under psychiatric care with a doctor who reported directly to MGM. For 3 weeks, Lana lived under this threat, essentially under house arrest. The studio-appointed psychiatrist visited daily, asking leading questions designed to be used against her if she didn't cooperate. Do you feel guilty about what happened? Do you have trouble sleeping? Do you sometimes feel the walls closing in? Every answer was documented. Every symptom was cataloged. They were building a commitment case in real time, and Lana knew it. One wrong word, and she'd disappear behind sanitarium walls. She was given enforced sedation to keep her calm and compliant, pills that left her foggy and slow. She was unable to speak publicly, except through studio-approved statements, carefully crafted by publicists. Even her clothing choices were dictated. Wear this dress. It makes you look fragile. Smile, but not too much. We need you to appear traumatized. In later years, Lana hinted the studio had made the threat of commitment explicit if she didn't cooperate. She understood clearly. Play by our rules, say what we tell you, maintain the narrative we've constructed, or we will have you locked away where no one can hear you. Daughter Cheryl revealed in her memoir that her mother lived in constant fear during that period. while Lana walked free. 14-year-old Cheryl carried different scars. Cheryl later revealed she'd prepared a bag, clothes, money, a bus ticket, hidden in her closet in case the studio actually took her mother away. Every time Lana left the house, Cheryl wondered if she'd ever see her mother again. The trial concluded with Cheryl's exoneration, and Lana returned to work. But she never forgot how close she had come to losing her freedom. Lana Turner's life continued until 1995. She had survived not just scandal, but the studio system's attempt to control her through threatened institutionalization. Her experience revealed institutionalization as more than treatment. It was a weapon wielded to silence stars who knew too much or simply became inconvenient. These stories reveal just how weaponized institutionalization became in Golden Age Hollywood. Which revelation has shocked you most so far? And what other dark corners of classic Hollywood should we investigate next? Leave your suggestions in the comments below. Your requests guide our research into the truths the studios tried to bury. Dorothy Dandridge, double marginalization. The woman who shattered Hollywood's color barrier by becoming the first Black actress nominated for Best Actress discovered that her historic achievement offered no protection from institutional abuse, compounded by discrimination embedded in America's healthcare system. Dorothy Dandridge represented a breakthrough in 1954 when her performance in Carmen Jones earned that historic Oscar nomination. But behind this professional triumph lived a woman facing pressures and discrimination that white contemporaries never endured. A double burden that would make her institutionalization uniquely cruel. Dorothy's career unfolded against constant discrimination that pervaded every aspect of her professional life. She couldn't stay in many hotels where she performed her nightclub act, forced to enter through service entrances and sleep in segregated quarters. She was barred from restaurants, even during her own film premieres, forced to eat in kitchens while white cast members dined elegantly. Studio executives refused to cast her opposite white leading men, limiting her to a handful of roles. Every achievement came with the asterisk of her race. Beyond professional discrimination, Dorothy carried an immense personal burden. Her daughter, Lynn, had been born in 1943 with severe brain damage requiring expensive lifetime institutional care. Biographer Donald Bogle documents that the emotional weight of having a daughter she couldn't care for at home, combined with financial exploitation by white managers, created overwhelming stress that eventually manifested as severe depression. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, Dorothy was hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric treatment. But healthcare in America remained deeply segregated. Medical historians have documented that psychiatric care in the 1950s and 60s separated patients by race, with Black patients receiving dramatically inferior treatment. Dorothy was placed in underfunded psychiatric wards where resources were scarce. She was given outdated therapeutic approaches that white patients in better-funded facilities no longer received. She was denied the private rooms and specialized care that white stars like Tierney were afforded. Where Jean received private rooms with flowers, Dorothy was placed in overcrowded wards. Her treatment was administered in facilities where staff's prejudices affected every interaction, where her pain was taken less seriously, where her symptoms were viewed through the lens of stereotypes about Black women's emotional instability. Her institutionalizations received minimal press coverage, while white stars' hospitalizations were reported extensively with concerned speculation. Dorothy's suffering was deemed less newsworthy. Even in her anguish, Dorothy remained invisible to the broader culture that had briefly celebrated her. The contrast was striking and cruel. When Tierney was institutionalized, magazines ran sympathetic features. When Vivien Leigh entered treatment, the press respectfully maintained her privacy. When Dorothy Dandridge sought help, she received segregated care while the press largely ignored her. September 1965. Dorothy Dandridge's body was discovered in her West Hollywood apartment. She was 42. The autopsy report was clinical, accidental overdose of the antidepressant tofranil. But those who knew her well read between the lines and suspected the overdose may not have been entirely accidental. Bogle wrote, "Dorothy broke Hollywood's color barrier, but when she needed help, the doors remained closed. Her daughter's care had drained her financially. White managers had exploited her earnings. The industry had limited her opportunities due to race. And when depression overwhelmed her, the healthcare system offered segregated treatment that valued her life less than white patients." Dorothy faced institutional abuse, compounded by discrimination embedded in every system meant to help her, and ultimately, the burden proved too much. Grief destroyed Tierney. Discrimination compounded Dorothy Dandridge's suffering, but our next star faced something that sounds like paranoid delusion, except it was absolutely, horrifyingly real. John Seberg, when the FBI used psychiatry as weapon. The idealistic young actress from Iowa, who became an international star and civil rights advocate, discovered that the FBI could weaponize psychiatric institutionalization as punishment for supporting causes J. Edgar Hoover deemed threatening. Jean Seberg was discovered by director Otto Preminger for St. Joan in 1957, a fresh-faced teenager who seemed to embody innocent American values. She became an international sensation in the French New Wave classic Breathless in 1960, her pixie haircut and effortless style making her an icon. But by the late 1960s, Jean had evolved from ingenue to activist. Her financial support for the Black Panther Party and involvement in civil rights causes made her a target of FBI Director Hoover's notorious COINTELPRO operations. Hoover viewed Jean as dangerous because her celebrity gave visibility to causes he opposed. A white movie star supporting black radicals? Hoover saw this as an infection needing elimination. Declassified FBI documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed the extent of the Bureau's campaign against Jean. The FBI waged sustained psychological warfare designed to destroy her mentally and professionally. FBI agents spread false rumors that she was pregnant by a member of the Black Panther Party when she was actually pregnant by her husband Romain Gary. Hoover himself approved memos ordering agents to plant this story in gossip columns. The stress from these FBI-planted rumors may have contributed to premature labor, resulting in the loss of her baby, a daughter who lived only 2 days. Agents planted deliberately false stories in newspapers, fabricating affairs and scandals. They conducted extensive surveillance, cars following her, clicks on her phone line, the same faces appearing wherever she went, creating genuine paranoia. Jean suffered a nervous breakdown following the loss of her baby and the revelation of the FBI's smear campaign. Between 1970 and 1979, she was hospitalized multiple times in psychiatric facilities in Switzerland and France. The paperwork tells the brutal truth. Commitments in 1970, 1972, 1976, and 1978. Each hospitalization followed intensified FBI operations. The cruelty was that she became convinced she was being watched, followed, and targeted, and her doctors diagnosed this as paranoid delusion. They treated her for paranoia without knowing her supposed delusions were real. FBI memos explicitly stated the Bureau's intention to cause her emotional distress and destroy her reputation. As she tried to explain that the government was persecuting her, they increased her medications and extended her hospitalizations, viewing her insistence as proof of worsening mental illness. In letters to friends preserved by biographer Gary McGee, Jean wrote about the impossibility of her position. How could she convince doctors she wasn't paranoid when the truth sounded exactly like a paranoid delusion? She wrote, "They think I'm insane because I say I'm being watched. But I am being watched. How do you prove you're sane when the truth sounds like madness?" Biographer David Richards documented that Jean's psychiatric treatments focused on medication to reduce her anxiety and paranoia, therapy to help her accept that her fears were unfounded, and institutionalization when she became too insistent about FBI persecution. Every treatment assumed her beliefs were delusional. None addressed the reality that she was correct. September 1979, Paris. Jean Seberg's body was discovered in her car, wrapped in a blanket in the back seat. She had taken her own life with a fatal dose of barbiturates. She was 40. She had left a note that read simply, "Forgive me, I can no longer live with my nerves." FBI files released shortly after revealed the full extent of the harassment campaign that had driven her to breakdown and institutionalization. Historian David Richards wrote, "The FBI drove her to madness, then her doctors treated the madness without knowing its cause." Jean Seberg's repeated institutionalizations represent perhaps the most sinister use of psychiatric commitment in this entire history. Weaponized not by studios or family, but by government agencies punishing political dissent. She was labeled paranoid for believing she was being persecuted, but she was absolutely right. The institutions that were supposed to heal her treated symptoms created by her government's deliberate psychological warfare, making her recovery impossible. They called her crazy for seeing what was really there. Could it get worse than government persecution? Yes, because our final star nearly lost her life when doctors dismissed a genuine medical emergency as nothing more than theatrical hysteria. Patricia Neal, the stroke they almost called madness. The Oscar-winning actress, who had survived heartbreak and built a successful career, nearly lost her life when doctors' assumptions about hysterical actresses almost prevented them from recognizing she was having a stroke. Patricia Neal had won the Academy Award for HUD in 1963 and seemed to have found stability. She had married writer Roald Dahl and built a family. February 1965. Patricia was 8 months pregnant with their 5th child at their home in England. Without warning, she suffered a massive stroke. The symptoms were unmistakable: sudden slurred speech, profound confusion, complete paralysis of her right side, inability to recognize family members. These signs should have immediately indicated a catastrophic neurological event requiring emergency intervention. Patricia's 1988 memoir, As I Am, and Roald Dahl's accounts document that initial doctors suggested the cause might be psychiatric rather than neurological. They proposed she might be having a nervous breakdown, hysterical pregnancy complications, that perhaps stress of impending motherhood had triggered a psychological episode. After all, actresses were prone to exaggeration, to seeking attention, to manufacturing symptoms. Surely this was theatrics, not a real emergency. Dahl furiously rejected this assessment and demanded a proper neurological examination. His insistence probably saved Patricia's life. He refused to accept their dismissal, refused to let them sedate her and send her to a psychiatric ward. When neurologists finally performed appropriate tests, they confirmed she had suffered a severe stroke requiring immediate surgery. But even during recovery, some medical staff continued to treat her slurred speech and confusion as theatrical behavior. The assumption that actresses exaggerated their symptoms nearly cost Patricia the intensive rehabilitation she needed. Neurologists who later reviewed Patricia's case confirmed that the initial delay could have been fatal. Stroke treatment is time-sensitive. Every minute without intervention means more brain tissue is destroyed. The hours lost while doctors considered psychiatric causes could have resulted in significantly worse outcomes or proven lethal. Dahl became his wife's fierce advocate, forcing doctors to treat her as a medical patient rather than a dramatic personality. He insisted on aggressive rehabilitation when some suggested Patricia might never recover. He demanded specialists when others were prepared to accept minimal improvement. Through grueling months of rehabilitation, Patricia had to relearn fundamental abilities: how to walk without assistance, taking one shaky step at a time, how to speak clearly enough to be understood, how to read and comprehend written words, how to write her own name. The recovery was agonizing and slow, but Patricia's determination combined with proper medical treatment achieved what many thought impossible. She returned to acting and won additional awards, including recognition for The Subject Was Roses in 1968. Medical historian Edward Shorter has documented that women's medical symptoms in the 1960s were routinely dismissed as psychological or hysterical, particularly for women in professions like acting associated with emotional expression. Patricia's case represented an extreme example of this dangerous bias. In her memoir, Patricia reflected on how close she came to being lost. If Roald hadn't fought them, I would have been institutionalized instead of treated. I would have perished in a psychiatric ward while doctors treated my supposed hysteria. Patricia told interviewer Barry Farrell in 1981 that the experience taught her women's medical symptoms were not taken as seriously as men's, that being an actress made doctors assume exaggeration rather than genuine emergency. Patricia became a passionate advocate for stroke survivors. Patricia Neal lived another 45 years after that stroke. 45 years doctors said she'd never have if Roald Dahl hadn't fought for her. Her life continued until 2010, when she passed away at age 84. Her survival represented not just personal triumph, but vindication that women's symptoms deserve to be taken seriously, that medical emergencies shouldn't be dismissed as psychological theater, and that proper treatment rather than institutionalization can achieve remarkable outcomes. Veronica Lake, the icon. They discarded the woman whose peekaboo hairstyle became a national sensation and whose sultry presence defined film noir, discovered that once her trademark look became a safety hazard and her star dimmed, Hollywood had no use for her, and institutionalization became the industry's way of erasing inconvenient has-beens. Veronica Lake was everywhere in the early 1940s. That cascading blonde hair falling over one eye became so iconic that women across America copied it. Her pairing with Alan Ladd in This Fire for Hire and The Glass Key made them one of Hollywood's most bankable teams. Paramount Pictures marketed her as their glamour queen, second only to the biggest names. But Veronica's fall from grace would be swift, brutal, and end in psychiatric wards that treated faded stardom as a mental illness requiring correction. The trouble began in 1943, when the government requested she change her signature hairstyle. Women working in factories were catching their hair in machinery while copying Veronica's look. She complied patriotically, pinning her hair back for the war effort. But Paramount executives panicked. Without the peekaboo hair, what made Veronica special? Box office returns for her next films dropped. The studio that had built an entire marketing campaign around one hairstyle had no idea what to do with her once it was gone. By 1948, Paramount had dropped her contract. Veronica was only 26 years old, but Hollywood had already decided she was finished. What followed was a descent that revealed how the industry treated actresses once their commercial value expired. Veronica struggled with alcoholism, drinking to cope with professional rejection and the realization that she'd been reduced to a hairstyle. Her 3 marriages collapsed under the pressure of her declining career and increasing dependence on alcohol. Between 1952 and 1962, Veronica was institutionalized at least 4 times for alcoholism treatment at facilities including Norwalk State Hospital in California. Medical records and journalist Jeff Lenberg's research document that the treatments she received were harsh and humiliating. She endured forced sedation that left her unable to function for days. Aversion therapy made her violently ill, conditioning her to associate alcohol with sickness. Group therapy sessions where staff encouraged other patients to verbally attack her for her past privilege and current failure. Isolation in locked wards when she protested treatment or insisted she wasn't getting proper help. But the cruelest aspect was how staff treated her fame as part of her pathology. Nurses and orderlies mocked her for having been a star. Oh, look who thinks she's special. Peekaboo Girl can't even remember to take her pills. They told her that her belief she'd once been important was delusional thinking, that she needed to accept she was nobody now. They used her past success as evidence of grandiosity requiring correction. Veronica later told interviewer Richard Lamparski in a 1966 interview, they treated being a has-been like it was a disease. Like remembering I'd once been successful was a symptom they needed to cure. The psychological damage from these institutionalizations compounded her struggles. Each commitment made employment harder to find. Studios wouldn't hire her. Television shows rejected her. Even stage productions turned her away, citing insurance concerns about her history of institutionalization. By the early 1960s, the woman who had once earned thousands per week was working as a barmaid in New York City, living in poverty. Columnist Earl Wilson found her working at the Martha Washington Hotel in 1962 and wrote a sympathetic piece that briefly revived public interest. But it was too late for any real career resurrection. The institutions hadn't cured her alcoholism. They'd simply added trauma and stigma that made recovery nearly impossible. Veronica Lake lived until 1973, passing away from hepatitis and acute kidney injury at age 50. Her obituaries focused on her tragic fall from stardom, but few mentioned the institutional abuse that had accelerated her decline. Biographer Jeff Lenberg later wrote, "Hollywood built her up, then threw her away. When she struggled with the aftermath, they locked her up and told her that remembering she'd once mattered was a sign of mental illness." Veronica's story reveals another dimension of institutional abuse, how it was weaponized not just against difficult or defiant women, but against those who had simply outlived their commercial usefulness. The industry that had profited from her image felt no responsibility for helping her once that image stopped generating revenue. Instead, institutionalization became a way to remove her from public view, to make her disappearance seem like inevitable decline rather than calculated abandonment. If Hollywood could discard Veronica Lake for losing commercial appeal, imagine what happened when an actress actually threatened to expose the industry's darkest secrets. Our next star discovered that knowing too much about powerful men's crimes could be the most dangerous thing of all. Barbara Payton, the woman who knew too much. The stunning blonde who moved effortlessly between A-list production and Hollywood's most dangerous underworld discovered that when you witness crimes committed by powerful men, psychiatric institutionalization becomes the threat that ensures your silence, or the punishment when you refuse to stay quiet. Barbara Payton exploded onto screens in 1949 with her beauty compared to Lana Turner's, an acting ability that earned genuine critical praise. She appeared in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye with James Cagney, proving she could hold her own opposite Hollywood's biggest stars. But Barbara made a fatal mistake. She became involved with men connected to organized crime, and she saw things that powerful people needed to keep secret. Barbara's romantic life became tabloid fodder, affairs with Gary Cooper and Bob Hope, a volatile relationship with actor Tom Neal, who beat actor Franchot Tone nearly to the point of ending his life in a fight over her. But beneath the scandals lay something more dangerous. Through her relationship with mobster Mickey Cohen and other underworld figures, Barbara witnessed criminal activities, heard conversations about payoffs to studio executives, and learned details about how organized crime controlled certain aspects of Hollywood's business operations. By 1952, Barbara had become a liability. Journalist James Parrish's research documents that she was approached multiple times by men who made it clear, "Stop talking about what you know, or there will be consequences." When she refused, when she drunkenly threatened to write a tell-all memoir exposing corruption, the threats became specific. "We'll make sure everyone thinks you're crazy. We'll have you locked up where nobody will believe a word you say." Between 1954 and 1958, Barbara was institutionalized at least 3 times at facilities, including Camarillo State Hospital. The commitments were ostensibly for alcoholism and mental instability, but Barbara told friends the real purpose was intimidation. Each time she talked about writing her book, each time she mentioned names or threatened to go to authorities, another commitment would be arranged. The treatments were deliberately punitive. Prolonged isolation in bare rooms with no stimulation for days at a time. Medications that left her so sedated she could barely speak coherently. Staff who treated her with contempt, calling her inappropriate names. Electroshock treatments administered without clear medical justification, creating confusion and memory loss that made it harder for her to remember the details she'd threatened to expose. Barbara's friend and writer, Leo Guild, documented in his book about Hollywood scandals that she once told him, "They want me to forget what I saw. Every time they strap me down for another treatment, I lose a little more. Pretty soon I won't remember enough to be dangerous anymore." The psychological impact was devastating. Barbara emerged from each institutionalization more dependent on alcohol, more isolated from legitimate employment, and less capable of functioning independently. The institutional abuse worked exactly as intended. By the late 1950s, Barbara's credibility was destroyed. She was seen as an alcoholic, a mental patient, a cautionary tale about the dangers of loose living. When she tried to tell people about corruption she'd witnessed, they dismissed her as delusional or attention-seeking. The institutions had successfully transformed her from a potential threat into someone nobody would believe. Barbara Payton's life continued its downward spiral through the 1950s and 60s. She eventually wrote her autobiography, I Am Not Ashamed, published in 1963. But by then, her credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed that the book was dismissed as sensationalized trash. The details she provided about Hollywood corruption and organized crime connections, many of which have since been confirmed by historians, were ignored because she'd been successfully branded as mentally unstable. She spent her final years in poverty, occasionally arrested for inappropriate conduct, completely ostracized from the industry that had once celebrated her beauty. May 1967, San Diego. Barbara Payton was discovered in her small apartment, having passed away from heart and liver failure. She was 39 years old. Her passing received minimal attention from the press that had once eagerly covered her scandals. Film historian James Parrish wrote, Barbara Payton knew too much, and institutionalization was the weapon used to ensure her knowledge would end with her. They couldn't end her life outright, but they could destroy her credibility, fragment her memories, and ensure that even when she tried to tell the truth, nobody would listen. Barbara's story represents perhaps the most cynical use of psychiatric institutionalization, not as treatment, not as control of inconvenient behavior, but as deliberate destruction of a witness who threatened powerful interests. The institutions didn't just fail Barbara Payton, they were weaponized against her with calculated precision. Every commitment, every treatment, every humiliation served the purpose of silencing her and ensuring her testimony would be worthless if she ever tried to expose what she knew. She was institutionalized, not for being ill, but for being dangerous to men who had the power to make her disappear behind sanitarium walls. These 12 stories represent far more than individual tragedies scattered across Hollywood's golden decades. They reveal a systematic pattern where psychiatric institutionalization became a weapon wielded against women who became inconvenient, difficult, or threatening. Frances Farmer and Jean Seberg were committed for political defiance. Clara Bow was betrayed by her father seeking control of her wealth. Lana Turner faced a threatened commitment to silence her knowledge of studio secrets. Jean Tierney was institutionalized because her grief made her family uncomfortable. Vivien Leigh received memory-destroying treatments for an illness medicine barely understood. Rita Hayworth spent 25 years misdiagnosed and shamed. McCambridge cycled through brutal addiction treatments that created more trauma than healing. Dorothy Dandridge faced all the control white actresses endured, plus the added cruelty of segregated, inferior care. Veronica Lake was discarded when her commercial value expired and institutionalized for being a has-been. Barbara Payton was silenced through institutionalization when she threatened to expose powerful men's crimes. And Patricia Neal nearly lost her life when doctors assumed hysteria rather than stroke. The common thread was the shocking ease with which women could be stripped of their freedom. Commitment laws allowed husbands to institutionalize wives with a single signature. Parents could commit adult daughters. Studios could pressure compliant doctors. Government agencies could drive targets to breakdowns, then use institutionalization to silence them further. Once committed, women faced treatments ranging from ineffective to actively harmful. Electroconvulsive therapy that destroyed memories, insulin shock that damaged brains, isolation that deepened psychological distress, and forced sedation that turned patients into compliant shells. The era's treatments reflected a primitive understanding of mental illness combined with a fundamental view of institutionalization as a control mechanism rather than a healing process. Electroshock therapy used voltages far higher than modern protocols, administered without anesthesia, causing seizures violent enough to break bones and memory loss so severe patients forgot years of their lives. Insulin shock therapy induced potentially fatal comas. Hydrotherapy subjected patients to ice baths, meant to shock them into compliance. Isolation in locked wards created sensory deprivation that worsened psychological conditions. For Dorothy Dandridge, discrimination added another layer of cruelty. She endured the same loss of agency as white actresses, but received segregated care in underfunded facilities, with outdated treatments and prejudiced staff who valued her suffering less. Her pain was taken less seriously. Her recovery was supported with fewer resources. Even her institutionalizations were deemed less newsworthy. But what happened to the institutions that mistreated these women? The system faced almost no accountability. Some doctors lost licenses, but most didn't. Western State Hospital was finally reformed in 1973, 2 decades too late. The studio system that threatened Lana Turner collapsed in the 1960s, but new power structures emerged. The FBI's COINTELPRO program was exposed in the 1970s, but Hoover never faced consequences. Legal reforms came too late, but their stories contributed to those reforms. Mercedes McCambridge's candor helped break the silence around institutionalization. Jean Tierney's autobiography revealed the reality behind sanitized studio narratives. Frances Farmer's posthumously published memoir exposed Western State Hospital's conditions. Rita Hayworth's misdiagnosis advanced Alzheimer's awareness through Yasmin's tireless advocacy. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If you were an actress in 1950s Hollywood and you knew what we know now, would you still have pursued stardom, knowing the price might be 7 years in an institution, or memories destroyed by electroshock, or your own government deliberately driving you insane? These 12 women answered yes. Some survived and found ways to transform suffering into purpose. Patricia Neal became a stroke recovery advocate. Mercedes McCambridge championed addiction treatment reform. Princess Yasmin turned her mother's tragedy into Alzheimer's research funding. Others, like Frances Farmer and Dorothy Dandridge, never fully recovered, their potential extinguished by systems claiming to help while actually destroying. As we watch their films today, Vivien Leigh's Scarlett O'Hara, Jean Tierney's otherworldly beauty in Laura, Dorothy Dandridge's groundbreaking Carmen Jones, Clara Bow's electric energy in It, Jean Seberg's iconic presence in Breathless, Veronica Lake's sultry film noir performances, Barbara Payton's star turn in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. We're witnessing more than performances. We're seeing the resilience of human spirits who endured forces designed to break and silence them. All of them deserve to have their complete stories told, not the sanitized versions studios manufactured. These weren't just Hollywood secrets buried to avoid scandal. They were battles for autonomy, dignity, and the fundamental right to exist on one's own terms without being locked away for the convenience of husbands, parents, studios, or government agencies. The institutions that promised healing became prisons. The treatments that offered cures destroyed memories and damaged brains. And the system that created these stars proved all too willing to discard them when they became difficult or threatening. But their legacies endure, not despite their institutional suffering, but illuminated by it. They were beautifully human, courageously defiant, and tragically vulnerable to a system that viewed women's autonomy as something to be controlled. They survived brutal treatment, family betrayals, studio machinations, government persecution, and medical dismissal of their genuine symptoms. And through it all, they created art that continues to move audiences decades after their struggles ended. They paid the price so we could have their art. The least we can do is remember the full truth of what that price cost them. If this investigation into Hollywood's institutional abuse moved you, please like this video and share it with anyone who loves classic cinema. These stories deserve to be remembered in their full truth, not the versions the studios wanted us to believe, but the reality of what these women endured and survived. And subscribe to Golden Age Files, where we're committed to honoring these stars by telling their complete stories, including the parts they were never allowed to tell themselves. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files, celebrating not just the glamour and artistry of Hollywood's golden age, but the courage it took to survive behind the carefully constructed dreams. These 10 women faced the darkest aspects of fame and institutional power, and their stories remind us that even our most beloved icons were real people who often paid an enormous price for our entertainment. Thank you for joining us in remembering their complete humanity.